My name is Judith Kohlenberg. I'm a migration researcher here at WU Vienna, and in today's episode I'm talking to Jesús Crespo. Jesús is a professor of economics at WU Vienna, and he conducts research on macroeconomics, demography, migration, and the effects of climate change on mobility and growth. His work has been published in leading journals such as Science and Nature, Climate Change, and he advises institutions like the World Bank on evidence-based migration policies. So welcome, Jesús. It's a great pleasure and an honor to have you on our podcast today.
Thank you, Judith. The pleasure is totally mine.
So, Jesús, we both had the pleasure and the honor of participating in a really interesting event last year with Milda, who was already a guest on this podcast too. An event that was concerned with myths around migration and how we as academics and as university scholars can bust these myths, or at least provide evidence for a more nuanced approach to some of the most common assumptions on migration. And this is why I would like to ask you the same question that I also asked Milda as a sort of starting point for our conversation. Namely, what is your favorite migration myth to bust and why?
Well, I have been working on busting migration myths and myths of other topics. When it comes to migration, there are a couple of myths which are very prevalent and which are actually easy to bust from an empirical point of view, but not always easy to get into people's heads. There is a very basic migration myth that is concerned with its size. The size of migration, how many migrants are in the world, how many migrants are in terms of the stock of populations in a given country, and how many people are migrating in a given moment in time. So people tend to overestimate those numbers by a lot, partly because migration is so prominent in the media, partly because migration is so prominent in the political discussion. But when you look at the numbers, some people get surprised about the size of migration stocks and the size of migration flow. So around 3.5% of the global population are foreign-born, and around 0.25% of the population of the world are actually migrating in a given moment in time. Though those numbers are way smaller than what people tend to perceive or tend to report when they are surveyed about it. On top of that, the relative size of refugees within the migration stocks is also usually assumed by many people to be much larger than it is. Right now, it accounts for around 10 to 15% of the migration stocks, and the migration stocks themselves are less than what people think. So on the one hand, the size of migration tends to be misrepresented in people's heads. On the other hand, the geography of migration also tends to be misrepresented. Most people tend to represent migration in their narratives as a south-north stream, while in reality, south-south migration tends to be the largest chunk of migration movements. And apart from size and geography, also the role of the determinants of migration also tends to be misunderstood or tends to be badly represented, partly in the media and partly by political agendas. I myself have been working on the role that environmental shocks play as a driver of human mobility and migration flows. There also you tend to be confronted with narratives that go in the direction of that we're going to be flooded by migrants as climate change makes certain environmental shocks more likely. That is also something that the empirical literature, the scientific literature, does not tend to find. The role of environmental shocks on migration is a very complex one, in the sense that the same way as it can incentivate migration, it can also trap populations and actually incentivate immobility. So the net effect is for sure not going to be the one that is usually portrayed in more apocalyptic media reports.
Why do you think these myths are so persistent? Because you now mentioned all this empirical evidence that we have. Also, we have to say for some of these aspects, like for instance, climate mobility, there are also empirical gaps, and there's still a lot to research on, of course. But what we know doesn't really point into the direction of, I don't know, a large flooding of migrants, an exodus from Africa to Europe, this idea that the whole continent of Africa is on the move and so on, you know, these more popular narratives that we have in media, but also in politics. Why do you think these myths are so persistent? Because I think what we're doing is important, but frankly, we are not the first to try and bust some of these myths from an academic point of view. But still, it seems difficult to counter some of these very, very strong and dominant narratives.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Let's differentiate two different things in here. On the one hand, the scientific literature on migration is as advanced as it gets. Having a look at the basically access to data that we have, the access to methods that we have. So we know more about migration than we have ever known. And we know it with methods which are very rigorous. Now, there's a difference between knowing a lot and then being able to change people's attitudes or people's misbeliefs on something, because in particular migration narratives, they tend to be encrusted within political identities and within political messages or political ideologies in a way in which they come in a package together with other group identifying beliefs that make people feel as part of a group. And these we know also from the empirical literature that these are the type of beliefs which are the most difficult to change, because, and this we know from economics, people take this belonging to a group as an asset, and therefore these beliefs as an asset. And things like education, confronting people with data, they are not usually very effective when it comes to changing misperceptions about beliefs which are part of a political ideology or which are part of a political identity. And again, migration is usually, or migration attitudes are a very important part of it. So this idea of beliefs as assets implies that if you have a look at the data, the main predictor of your attitudes towards particular political aspects, in this case, say migration, is not your education, it's not your age, it's not your socioeconomic status, but it is your prior beliefs on that. So you are confronted with perceptions, and in some cases misperceptions, which are extremely persistent over time. And that are very difficult to break, and where science communication maybe has not been concentrating until now on the right instruments to change them. So it is very cheap, thinking also about market forces. It is very cheap to disseminate wrong information about something in a way in which it's a very asymmetric type of effort that you would need to do in order to break those myths. So in that respect, thinking about how science communication can actually be effectively used to create evidence-based beliefs about reality implies that maybe some of the work that we scientists are doing is not properly managed. Think about the fact that we tend to communicate in the form of large reports with a lot of detail on methods, and in the end we know that the debunking heavy campaigns, they are not very successful. We know that from the data, and information policy alone is not enough. You need to also appeal to the type of social psychological triggers that make people actually realize that they might be wrong about something. And doing that is something that we have not been trained to do, we scientists. So the focus should be in very focused messages that actually make people understand that this expert who's speaking is not speaking from a dimension which is not yours. That's the reason why looking for the right messengers to communicate evidence-based stories is, we know, particularly important to change misperceptions of people. Think about, the difference of having an economist on TV talking about GDP growth being relatively low versus you encountering a business owner who has lost his or her job or who's having problems getting new workers.
And I mean, I think we have an added issue perhaps that has only been growing in the last couple of years, sparked by the pandemic, but not only. And we have a lot of data on this by now, that there is a growing distrust in science and in academia, right? And this narrative of us being in an ivory tower and not really in touch with reality, whatever that reality would be, is again a growing narrative. And I think it adds to the problematization of how can we as academics who are working on this topic empirically communicate some of these results from our research. And as you said, are we the right messengers? But also, is it just about getting the facts right, or is it at a deeper level really also about an emotional level that is always there, I think, as human beings in the world? You know, we like to consider ourselves very rational, but we both know that humans are not when it comes down to it. And there is also this emotional dimension that I do think populist parties and populist movements are really good at addressing and instrumentalizing even. But of course, we as scientists and academics are hesitant to also signal towards this dimension. So my question to you, and I don't think there is a straight-cut yes or no answer, but perhaps your position on that, how much emotional storytelling should there be, can there be in science communication? Or would you say this is a very clear line that has to be drawn because that's not our job as academics, and really then we should sort of offer up our evidence to journalists or other communicators who really then have to translate this evidence into stories and narratives that make sense to the wider public?
Yeah, needless to say, I don't have an answer to that, but I have a couple of thoughts that might sound like an answer. So first of all, you're completely right that this narrative about ivory towers and science as an elite is just one extra aspect of the political portfolio that you are buying with one of those political identities that we were talking about before. Now, and that is this us versus them narrative is well known to be one of the defining aspects of populism, which is, as we know, on the rise. Together with that, actually the moral framing that comes with the defense of such populistic ideas is something that has worked very well, but that does not work well when it comes to communicating scientific evidence. And there's quite a lot of evidence on that also from empirical studies on science communication. So in principle, our job as scientists should avoid moral framing. Moral framing tends to backfire and tends to make people that eventually hold a particular type of misbelief be more defensive about that misbelief. This belief updating process is known to be reduced through moralization, compassion, and these type of instruments that otherwise work well in populistic narratives. That implies that actually the messenger matters, and you're right to think that certain types of communication profiles might want to use something that would be closer to moral framing. As a scientist, as an economist, and a scientist in general, I would be very hesitant to put that in the forefront of the strategy when it comes to science communication. And I think that the evidence that we have until now is that it tends to backfire more than it tends to work.
So we do need this close collaboration then with other stakeholders in the field, right? I mentioned media and journalists who might be the first addressees of our evidence in order to do this very important translation work and then preparing evidence into stories, into narratives, into actual articles they publish for the wider public. But also, I would say, policymakers are still addressees of some of these reports that you mentioned. So yes, this experience, I think, is very common, that you put a lot of time and effort into a report and you feel the number of people who've actually fully read and understood it is quite limited. But still, it's important work that has to be done by academics like ours, right? In different fields and with different scenarios in mind.
Indeed, but at the same time, the translation needs to be done with other type of skills. Also, after you have done all the heavy statistical empirical work that we usually tend to do for our studies, you are very convinced about the rigor that is behind that, and that is the type of rigor that can be communicated among scientists. But the standard person on the streets could not care less about statistics. In reality, the way in which the results of your study can be transformed into eventual busting of misbeliefs has to come through stories and narratives that get to people. And that part is the part that we don't tend to get well nowadays. Because, as I said, moral framing does not seem to work. It seems like particular examples, breaking down the idea that you have population and demographic dynamics into that idea that, hey, business owners are indeed saying that they cannot find a job, or that they cannot find workers, or older workers cannot find a job because the skills that they have been depreciated over time. All of these type of translating larger scientific messages to particular examples that people would be able to deal with is what we know tends to work for eventually busting misbeliefs. I believe that we scientists are not trained to do that, and it's okay. There are other people that should do that. We can help, but we don't need to be the ones that do the whole work. Also, if you think about the role that policymakers are, or other type of civil society institutions have, they are there for something. Our job as scientists ends also at some point where we should be able to transport those results to another messenger that will do hopefully the job better to eventually bust those myths.
This is something interesting you said, and I would like to pick this up right away, because in theory, this is a very sort of clear process, or more or less clear process in the way that you now presented it. So we as scientists have these rigorous methods in place. Then also, very importantly, there is a lot of quality control, of course, in academia, peer review process, etc., usually double-blind. And I mean, you published in one of the most renowned journals worldwide, where the process is very, very rigorous. And also you have a certain amount of communication that is already inherent in the fact that when you publish in such a world-renowned journal like Science, of course, there will be attention to what is published in there more than perhaps in other journals. But still, as you correctly said, at some point we have to hand over all the evidence and the empirical findings to another societal actor, and this actor is perhaps journalists, media, also policymakers. And ideally, they translate this evidence into actual stories. They look for examples of people who might be concerned by this, and who can also provide this much needed, I would say, anecdotal evidence that comes sort of in as an addition to the empirical evidence. In theory, this is a great kind of line of collaboration. In practice, we know from perhaps also personal experience, there might be distortions along the way.
Absolutely.
And there is already one aspect of one topic you mentioned, climate migration, or to be more correct, because you researched a lot on that, climate conflict migration, which is even more of sort of a loaded topic, I feel. And in my personal view or perception of how both media, policy, activism, and other actors try to frame climate migration, this is increasingly removed from what I take to be the actual evidence that is out there. And there is one very sort of negative example, and I keep citing it. There was a World Bank report a few years back on climate migration and the evidence out there. And the report talked exclusively about internal migration. So what would the effects be of huge climate shocks on internal migration, not crossing borders? And in many, many media reports, and also in quality media, right, the reporting completely lost the internal part, and it was all about migration as a whole. And now, I would say in 10 out of 10 cases, people take migration to mean crossing borders, and also to mean, additionally, when you look at African migration, transcontinental migration towards Europe, so south to north, actually. And this is, in my view, a clear distortion that happened. We can debate whether it was done deliberately or not, if it was a mistake, etc., but it happens. So how do we deal with this if this happens? Is it then the role, the purpose, the function of a scientist and of an academic to also try to correct this perception? Can we offer something? How do you deal with this if it really concerns your own research, where I think also an element of, let's say, personal interest or even vanity comes in? You want your own research and your results to be rightly presented and represented in the public. So how would you sort of navigate this very tricky field?
Yeah, there are several very important points in here. One of them is related to what we were talking before when it comes to science communication, the way in which the role of environmental shocks and climate change on migration has been presented, apart from having been partly misrepresented, also tends to build upon this idea of linearity, this idea that when something happens, then on average something else will always happen, and on average something else will always happen. And that means that, I don't know, if you have a flood or if you have a drought, then that will almost deterministically lead to something else. Now, that precisely in the case of the effect of environmental shocks on migration or lack thereof, we know that those mechanisms are extremely complex and extremely nonlinear in the sense that they are mediated by a whole lot of other factors, one of them being conflict that you already mentioned. So presenting a linear narrative is already misleading, independently of in which direction it goes. On top of that, now linguistics enters the game. The fact that internal migration and international migration are mixed with each other creates yet another layer of confusion when it comes to creating communication out of it, and also when it comes to using that eventually as a weapon of populist propaganda. We know that the most efficient way of combating those type of, in this case, real misrepresentations of scientific results is to concentrate on specific false beliefs or specific false representations. So in the example that I gave in the very beginning, this idea that people might think that refugees are 70% of the actual migration stock, and they are 10, let's go to that point and let's just communicate, hey, you just got that number wrong. It's not 70%, it's 10%. It turns out, by what we know from the literature, that concentrated on very specific misrepresented, be it figures, be it mechanisms, that tends to work much better than trying to change trying to debunk every possible misconception that is out there. So that idea of concentrating also on simple messages when it comes to debunking seems to be an important tool that we have. When it comes to the case of environmental shocks, conflict and migration, the thing is much more complicated to communicate in the following sense. There's also a lot of misunderstanding about the role that climate change will play in creating environmental shocks. So we observe environmental shocks, we observe droughts, we observe floods, we observe extreme temperatures. Equating that with climate change itself is already something where we know that you cannot, from a scientific point of view, you cannot do that. It could have been the case that even without climate change, those events would have happened. So there's a lot of work being carried out in a sub-discipline within climate research and also in the social sciences called climate attribution studies, where basically what you would do is you would observe an environmental shock and then you would try to understand, together with climate models, whether that shock would have also happened in a world with less CO2 concentration in the air, in such a way that you can assign certain type of, in this case, socioeconomic outcomes that would be triggered then by that environmental shock to climate change or not. They might as well have happened even with the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere that we had prior to industrialization. So this idea that certain socioeconomic outcomes, and in this case related to human mobility, would be tracked back to climate change is already something that for us scientists it's not obvious. It would be a case-by-case type of story. To communicate that is very, very complicated, because there's also the narrative that every single environmental phenomenon that we see tends to be linked to some kind of narrative about climate change. And I don't think that that's helping us also understand how environmental shocks affect migration, and about the fact that environmental shocks affect migration in a way in which it doesn't seem to be the one that is being presented in many media reports, let's say it like that, and in many political narratives. Actually, what we know also about the fact that about how droughts and floods, in particular droughts, affect migration, as I said before, is that they might as well affect it in the direction of increasing it internally or decreasing it, in the sense that it would trap populations that would, due to the lack of possibilities of having the income to migrate, they would be then stuck in a region where they would not want to be in terms of their attitudes.
Which is also advanced through these newer migration models like the Aspirations Capabilities Framework,
Indeed.
Right? That really shows you that it depends very much on the resources that you also need to migrate, right? Or processes like urbanization that might occur as a first
Exactly.
step. So really, really a much more nuanced approach to what you
Exactly.
just said.
So, which basically implies that a given drought year of the same intensity is not the same depending on the community it affects, depending on the part of the country that it affects, and it might lead to the exact opposite reaction, in some cases to internal migration, in some cases even a part of it to international migration, in many other cases to actually a reduction in the migration that would have otherwise taken place. Now, I was going to say we economists, but I mean it's scientists in general. We feel comfortable within that degree of complexity, because our job is to make sense out of that complexity. But there is no simple, straightforward explanation that then can be easily communicated for everybody to have it in their heads and be able to answer the question, what happens when there is a drought with migration? Because, there's a lot of, it depends. If this is there, if you are a household that is mostly living off agricultural income, if you are a household that is actually in the outskirts of a city where they would have a job in a city, all of these nuisances is something that we scientists, we know how to deal with them within empirical models or theoretical models, but that then they do not fit this typical linear story of climate change leads to more drought leads to more conflict leads to more refugees. They all come from sub-Saharan Africa to Europe. It's just not like that.
And maybe going back to part of my original question, what would you do if you saw your very specific research on that very much distorted in media, or you found it to be distorted, right? So let's say you have this peer-reviewed study published in a very renowned journal, and then there is some or more than one, several media outlets that represent or focus on one minor aspect, disregard all this complexity and nuance that you just took time and effort to showcase, and that I think is really relevant, and that results in an article or in a media report that, in your view, heavily distorts your results. Would it be just an experience of, well, stuff happens and let's move on to the next research, or would it be, in your own point of view, right? And I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to this, part of your responsibility as a scientist, as a researcher, to try and correct that and to maybe offer your own view by, I don't know, writing an op-ed or offering an interview and so on. I know that colleagues have reacted differently to this, sure, right? So it's not clear cut, but in your personal opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I would for sure be proactive when it comes to correcting pieces of information that misrepresent my own research results. I can also understand that some people would not be, in the sense that, you know, that the scientific sector is a sector of its own, and you know, you are doing your stuff, and you know, writing an opinion piece in a newspaper does not advance your scientific career. So I can imagine that for some people it would be optimal from a rationality point of view just to say, okay, somebody wrote something which was not exactly what I found. Let me just forget about it. In my case, I feel a little bit responsible for what science communication does with my science or with my scientific results. And the good thing about it is that in the 21st century, you do have a whole lot of instruments to at least try to correct that, from writing a blog, piece, doing a podcast, publishing a small piece in your homepage at your university. You know, we do have a lot of mechanisms to at least try to correct that. In particular, because that affects also your reputation, in the sense that, you know, you might end up being remembered as the person whose result led to this or led to that. And we still have quite a lot of responsibility with ourselves, in the sense of being able to go to bed and sleep well and sound for the night. So in my case, that's clearly what I would do. Still, as I said, the market might not put a very strong weight into correcting those type of things. And with the market, I mean basically the academic market, where in the end it's about publishing, it's about eventually doing good teaching. But, you know, science communication is not something that until recently has been seen as part of our job.
I mean, I do feel that, as you correctly said, until recently, there is a growing awareness, especially among younger cohorts of researchers, and especially in fields that are so heavily contested, like migration, but also climate change and others, where researchers become more proactive and perhaps also more confident. Maybe sometimes in also negative ways, but overall I think it's positive that they also say this is our research. And this is also something where we do see a certain responsibility. After all, our salaries are paid by taxpayers' money. So there is perhaps also an obligation for the taxpayer at large to provide that kind of evidence and to make sure that it is not distorted. And it's part of our role, actually, to also engage in what universities call third mission, right? You mentioned teaching and research, but increasingly, and also in our new rectorate here at the WU Vienna, this has become more of a focus issue. I think rightly so, because the trend overall also seems to go into that direction. What is the role and the function of scientific research in the 21st century, especially in a time and age where it is coming increasingly under threat and attack from populist forces, so that there is a growing awareness that this might become part of your obligation. So perhaps it's also a generational thing. But as you correctly said, it comes with a lot of strings attached, right? So on the one hand, exposing yourself into the public debate, which is very different from the scientific and academic debate, perhaps also becoming a point of attack, which I think many climate researchers experienced over the past couple of years, but also migration researchers. And then again, it takes away time and resources from the work you are actually paid for and the work that is actually being evaluated in this very strict and some might say cutthroat business that academia has for some become, of course, right? It's not the main metric that you have to focus on. So there is, I think, it's difficult to strike the right balance for some, really, because you only have so many hours in the day. And how much can you engage with the public debate that is not your main peer group? So
absolutely, you're completely right, and well, many of us also see it as a responsibility to let your knowledge or the new knowledge that you have created be communicated to the broader audience. Sometimes we ourselves are not the best ones at that, so that doesn't imply that you need to do it yourself. And also modern universities do have the resources that it takes to create institutions that channel those research results. Without you, as a scientist, we usually do not even have the right language to communicate our results properly. So it is something where universities not only have invested, but should even invest more, in a way in which also the nuisances of scientific output are rightly passed over. And that is a problem that usually it's a balance that is very difficult to strike. How can you communicate your results in a way in which you feel confident that the level of uncertainty about your results has been communicated properly, and that you don't exaggerate something in a way in which you might feel like you are becoming an activist, or however you want to call it, or you are basically betraying your own scientific principles. Again, I don't think that we scientists are very good at that, and well, some of us might be, and they should do it. In some of the cases, we need a job. There's a job profile that, unfortunately, is very few people that have it. That are people who can actually do that, who can translate scientific results to the public in a way in which both the scientists and the public get something out of it, in the sense that the scientist does not feel that the scientific integrity has been betrayed by simplifying the message in such a way, and where eventually particular false beliefs of people might be addressed in a way that it could create indeed societal change in a positive manner, in the best way in which a scientist can do it, which is by communicating scientific results. I feel like, and having been longer in my job as an academic, we are in the transition period to be able to do that better than we have ever done it before. When I think back about the way, in particular, that economics was being communicated, or economic research was being communicated 20 years ago, and I'm thinking about Austria, but the same applies to any other European country that I'm familiar with. There's a huge difference, and there's indeed a new generation of scientists that are willing and partly able to do that better than it has ever been done before. The enemy of pseudoscience is very strong. That's the problem, and it has become even stronger over time because it has been also channeled over through populist movements. So it's, I would say, we're not there yet, but we are right on track when it comes to creating this channeling part of our job.
Mm-hmm. That's a hopeful message. I
I
feel.
hope so. I'm an optimist, as most economists are. In spite of us being called the dismal science, we tend to be particularly optimistic.
Because it's, at the end of the day, it's all psychology too, right? So you have to be optimistic.
Sure.
At the end of this very inspiring conversation, I would like to ask you a bit more of a personal question, because not only are you an economist researching migration, you are a migrant yourself.
Indeed.
I mean, many people wouldn't call you a migrant, they would call you an expat. We know the differences and, you know, all the connotations that come with it, highly educated from a European country, etc., etc. But still, strictly speaking, you are an international migrant. So,
Indeed.
And you have an experience of living here in Austria and having lived here for decades, really, but also other countries in the European Union, but also in the US, I take it. What has struck you most about the discourse, the public discourse on migration in Austria, a country that has for decades now had a very strong populist force, earlier than many other European countries, in comparison to Spain, for instance, to the US, to other European countries where we've perhaps only seen this development over the last couple of years? Is there a difference that you noticed as a migrant yourself?
Yeah, well, Austria was particularly visionary when it comes to setting a trend. Yeah, actually, it has to be one of the first cultural shocks that I really experienced in here. I came to Austria, Vienna in particular, Austria in general, in the mid-90s. And my first cultural shock was, I believe, there were the posters that said, Wien darf nicht Chicago werden. Back then it was Istanbul, but back then it was Vienna should not become Chicago. Coming from Spain, which, I mean, not anymore, but I had the feeling back then in the mid-90s that we were a young democracy, and that being a young democracy also implied that we were very proud of being particularly politically correct when it comes to democratic values, when it comes to liberal values. So I was blown away by the fact that you could eventually put a poster in the middle of the city that was obviously attacking migrants in this case, because we are talking about migration. I could give examples from many other corners of the societal spectrum. So my first thought was, if you put up such a poster in Spain back then, you would lose votes, because that was not accepted socially. You know, you would be outing yourself as somebody with illiberal values and
radical, even in a way. Right?
Yeah, not only. I mean, you could be radical in other ways, but you know that was just not socially acceptable. It was the German language has the first word. It was not the best word. It was not salonfähig.
Yeah.
So it was not. It will steal votes from you. Now think about that nowadays, and we're talking. I mean, it's already 30 years afterwards. Nowadays, this is what you find everywhere. So in that respect, that was for me extremely shocking. What was the same shocking was to see that those type of illiberal values, let me call them illiberal values, and populistic views about migration were not only present on the right side of the spectrum, but also on the left side of the spectrum, with another type of narrative which was much more related to cheap labor and to this idea that, you know, in particular Eastern European, then with the opening of the European Union to the East, that Eastern European workers will eventually be dumping wages and all that stuff, and which basically basically you had a narrative that worked on the populist sides of both parts of the spectrum. Over time, you know, the right took over all of that visionary communication skills that Austria had to provide. I know that in a podcast, irony that's not. But believe me, I mean it in an ironic manner. However, on the left side of the spectrum, these values are still around in this country, and they are not present in some other countries. So the Spanish populistic left, which is also very much in the arena, in the media arena, they are, you know, the divide, the populistic divide that they try to play with is the workers versus business owner. You know, this type of little bit more old Marxist type of exactly ancient Marxist type of narrative. While here you still have the divide that goes from foreign worker versus national workers. Workers. This is something also that back then was shocking to me, and that it's still shocking to me, to be obvious, and that also basically implies that there is a narrative of divide that crosses the whole spectrum of left-right. I also believe that that's also a typical example of why the left-right divide has already long ago stopped making sense when it comes to try to understand modern politics and modern geopolitics in this case. And that was another thing that was pretty shocking for my experience in here. Otherwise, my own personal experience has been very positive when it comes to being a migrant that was not able to speak German very well for quite some time, and that had to also struggle with the typical type of small cultural shocks that come from living in such an interesting country as Austria.
You said that in a very diplomatic manner now, and it is interesting. It never gets boring, does it?
Indeed. Yeah.
Maybe to sort of come to an end slowly and ask you a question to round it all off, because I do want to end on an optimistic note. And you said that economists are optimists, so that's a great start, I think. What would your hopes be for the overall field of migration research? Of course, here at WU, but in general, I would say of its potential contribution to the policy and political debate out there, where you very rightly characterized it as sometimes perhaps almost collapsed in the sense that this us versus them narrative, this zero-sum thinking has become so strong over time, and these visionary, inverted commas, visionary populist stance is gaining more and more ground. What would your hopes be for science communication in this heavily contested field?
Yeah, sometimes the being too concentrated in trying to be an instrument of change might be a bad thing in the following sense. How is the expression? The path to heaven is paved with good intentions, mm-hmm. right? So sometimes this aim to want to make things right at a societal level, which is something that you just emphasized in the through science, of course, in your statement. Sometimes that could blind the fact that our very first aim should be to do great science, and that the aim to change societal values does not necessarily lead to good science, but that very good science can be the best path from our sector to actually achieve some kind of change at the societal level. In that respect, what I hope and what we observe also, in that sense I'm optimistic, is that the access to new data, the access to better methods, also through technological improvements that many people see as risky, such as artificial intelligence and all these access to computing power that we have never had before. Actually, we scientists see that as an asset, as something that might work as an instrument for us to create great scientific knowledge. And that if there's something that I would hope for migration research, for research in general and migration research in particular, will be that the years ahead and eventually the decades ahead will make us be able to understand the migration phenomenon much better, thanks to the access we're going to have to much better data and to much better methods. And that then will be able to create some kind of societal change in the sense of making people's beliefs be aligned with empirical facts and not with populistic narratives independently of where they come from.
That is a great aspiration, I think, to have people's beliefs more aligned with empirical evidence. That's, I think, a very hopeful note. And as you rightly mentioned, these new technologies or overall new developments on the horizon can also be an opportunity. Now we are very much, I think, in a risk or kind of threat narrative, also when it comes to AI. Partly rightly so, but we shouldn't also forget that with each new technology, there were also new opportunities for mankind, really, and especially for science and research. Thank you so much for being my guest today, Jesus. That was excellent. I really enjoyed talking to you. And thank you also for sharing your personal insights into what it means to be a migrant in Austria. I hope that there will be many more empirical evidence and research coming from your side, contributing not only to migration, but also the other aspects that come with sort of macroeconomics and sustainable development also in a world like this. Thank you so much for being my guest today. And thank you to all of you for listening to this episode today. And I hope you will tune in next time again.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here.